everybody. Today I want to talk about a great book that I found called The Human Magnet Syndrome: Why We Love People Who Hurt Us by Ross Rosenberg. He's a psychotherapist in Illinois, I believe. He has a website if you want to check him out as well. This book is wonderful for understanding, what draws you into the dynamics of narcissistic abuse. Like, how did that happen? How does it keep going, and what responsibility do you have? Because, if you entered into a relationship with a narcissist or a psychopath or sociopath, then, there's something inside of you that attracted that. There's something inside of you that was the perfect opposite attraction. Just like in nature, atoms form molecules based on attraction, right? So positive, negative charge attracts. And when people talk about life being a mirror and the people that we meet being a mirror of us, it's not that we meet the exact same person. What we meet is a mirror reflection. Just like you're looking in here right now, this probably looks backwards to you because it's a mirror reflection. And so the human magnet syndrome, Ross Rosenberg goes into what he calls the continuum of self. And, this is about one's self-orientation, how much one is focused on other people, on other people's needs and feelings and whatnot, and how much one is focused on oneself, on one's own needs and feelings and whatnot. So he draws the continuum from, -5 to +5, the -5 being the extreme codependent who is entirely selfless, puts everybody first, feels incredible amount of guilt for expressing, guilt and shame for expressing one's own needs or setting one's own boundaries, all the way to +5, which is like the true narcissist who has zero capability of meeting anybody else's needs or even recognizing that other people have needs because they're entirely focused on themselves. And then everywhere in between, being progressively less and less of a codependent, less of an emotional manipulator. Ross uses the term emotional manipulator to describe these people. And one of the great things is he makes the analogy of a dance, and this dance that goes on between the codependent and the narcissist, and how this dance takes place. And he says that the two of them are together in what's like a common deniability. Both of them are in denial, right? The codependent is in denial about the abuse and about enabling or being accomplice to the abuse, and the emotional manipulator is in denial about what they're doing. And even if they realize what they're doing, they're still in denial about it. They push that away, whether consciously or unconsciously, and they just don't deal with it. They don't see it. So the two keep engaging until one of them stops the dance. The whole relationship is based on the deniability that both of them have, which, is basically based on dysfunction. It is a dysfunctional relationship. And he says in here, they share a distorted belief that the other will make them feel whole. And, one of the most important things to realize after you get out of a narcissistically abusive relationship is that you do not need someone else to complete you, that you are whole and complete unto yourself. And if you don't feel that way, then you need to go work on that. You need to stop looking for the solution outside yourself. You need to stop looking to others for a sense of approval or validation. You need to stop looking to others as, someone to fix and take care of, and instead turn that inward a bit and focus on, how do you need to take care of you? What can you do to take care of you? What can you do to honor you? What can you do to fix yourself, to heal yourself, and to take that 100% responsibility for your life? Ross talks about the attraction, the intense chemistry between, the codependent and the emotional manipulator. And he says, it is their opposite personalities of self-orientations that bind the codependent and emotional manipulator together in an enduring dysfunctional relationship. One of the great things is he goes into, how did we get there? Like, how did we get to this point? And he talks about the childhood patterns and how during childhood, essentially, the template is formed for your idea of what is love, what is a relationship, how do two people treat one another, and how, it always comes back to this original family wound of what happened in childhood. around love, around relationships. And, the codependent learns to be the caretaker, learns to placate, learns to fix. The emotional manipulator learns to do the same kind of abuse to get their needs met. They start manipulating, they start abusing, they become the taker and the controller. And, if you grew up in a house with a narcissistic parent and you became the codependent, it's like you're seeking unconsciously a person to control you, a person who needs you to fix them, to appease them, to take care of them, to validate them, to give them like a sense of affection and importance, or just to be someone that they boss around and become domineering and controlling of their life. And, when he talks about this continuum of self, you can really take a look because he describes, what is a -5 like? What is a -4, -3, -2, up to like, the +5. And he gives a little description. And it's really wonderful to see, like, where are you on that scale? Where were you before your last relationship that you got into with an emotional manipulator? Where were you during the relationship, and where are you right now? And what he says is that, this dance ends essentially when the codependent gets healthy. And when the codependent gets healthy, it's because the codependent learns how to set new boundaries, how to, express needs and, emotional feelings and perspectives of reality, and being able to do so with more confidence, and then being able to enforce those boundaries. Whereas the emotional manipulator is not going to like those boundaries at all. They're going to start to freak out, get pissed off, maybe escalate the abuse. And that's a definite sign something's not right. So the codependent hopefully sees this pattern and says, okay, that's my sign. I need to leave this relationship. This person is unable to honor my limits, to honor my boundaries. And, that's one of the easiest ways to determine if someone in your life is toxic and manipulative. It's as soon as you set that boundary and you say, okay, this is what's okay for me. This is how I need you to respect, my boundaries, my wishes, my needs. If you're unable to meet these, then this isn't going to work. And how that person responds will let you know how toxic that person is. Maybe it's someone you've known for a really long time. Maybe they're not a toxic person. You set a new boundary and they're like, oh, okay. And it takes them a minute to get used to that. Maybe you say, don't call at this time, or don't do this, please. And the person like, okay, now they need to get used to that. But then they get used to that and they start treating you very differently. They start honoring your boundary. They have no problem with this. They don't turn it around on you and try to guilt you because you set that boundary. If you say, don't stop by my house like that. I don't like that. If you want to see me, then, call me, text me in advance, make sure I'm going to be around, make sure I'm going to be available. Don't just drop by the house. I don't like that. And then the person says, well, I just feel unwelcome. You're making me feel unwelcome. And that's just, I don't want to feel this way. You are making me feel unwelcome. It's like, okay, that's a guilt trip. That's the person telling you they're not going to respect your boundary. All they care about is their own needs. I feel unwelcome. I want the right to come drop by anytime I want. I don't care what you want. I don't care if you don't think that's all right for you. I don't care if that triggers your PTSD when suddenly there's like a knock on the door and you're freaking out and like you weren't expecting anyone. They don't care. They're not listening to you. They don't care about your boundaries. They don't care about your needs. So when you set that boundary and someone abuses that, and then they try to turn it around on you as if it's your fault and it's your problem for setting that boundary, when that is a very reasonable boundary to set, then you know very well that you're dealing with a toxic emotional manipulator. He talks about how the codependents are going to be much more likely to seek out therapy and other forms of healing and help, whereas the emotional manipulator is much less likely to do that. The emotional manipulator will typically not ever admit that there's a problem, not ever admit that what they're doing is wrong, not ever admit to doing wrong things that hurt other people, and unable to take self-responsibility for their actions. They will always pretend to be the victim, pass off the blame on everybody else, and either avoid therapy or often end up confusing and raveling up the therapist into their emotional manipulation games. Many therapists talk about how they got sucked in and didn't realize what was going on, and it's really dangerous for the codependent who might end up getting blamed for what's going on, for the abuse. And as you've probably figured out, the whole game of the emotional manipulator is to get you to focus on your reaction to the abuse and not to the abuse itself. And, then you end up thinking that you're crazy. You end up thinking something is wrong with you. You end up thinking you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not sexy enough, you're not open-minded enough, you're not adventurous enough, you're not whatever enough to meet these excessive demands of the emotional manipulator, which again is just reminiscent of childhood and the excessive demands that were put on you by the narcissistic parent, which if you did not meet, you would not receive their conditional love. They were able to love you and care for you when you pleased them, when you fulfilled their needs and wants. And he talks about in here, he says that, emotional manipulators will rationalize their conduct as either being necessary or normal. And that's when they tell you, well, you made me do it. And you did this, so I did that. And it's your fault and it's your problem. And wow, look at you. You're just crazy. You're so unhinged. You're so unstable. You're bipolar. You're oversensitive. You're paranoid, and they turn these things around. They have to project their negative feelings on you. They have to project their, destructive behavior on you. And then they'll go off and tell everyone else that you're crazy, and they will push and provoke you in front of other people until you lose it. And then in front of other people, they'll be like, see, I told you, crazy, totally crazy. And emotional manipulators are men and women. The narcissistic personality disorder and the psychopath, the sociopath, what they call antisocial personality disorder, tends to occur more in men, whereas the borderline personality disorder tends to occur more in women. And, you'll find so many people, both genders, get caught up in these relationships, either with a very abusive man or a very toxic woman. And they get into these same traps, and he goes into a little bit about, what are the hallmarks of narcissistic personality disorder? What are the hallmarks of borderline personality disorder? And this is for your benefit, to read this over. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to pretty much figure out, what your partner is. Like, you don't have to have a therapist say, okay, I can see this person is this or that. They don't know that person like you do. And, the manipulator only reveals themselves to the people who are closest, to the people that they are taking advantage of. And that's why you feel so alone and isolated. So, you don't have to wait for someone to diagnose that person to understand that you are with an emotional manipulator. It doesn't matter if they technically have narcissistic personality disorder or if they technically have antisocial personality disorders. These are all just labels that, expert psychologists have come up with, but still they're just labels. And the bottom line is that these are very abusive, emotionally manipulative, sick people. So on the continuum of self, like I said, you can kind of see like where you are on that continuum, and you can kind of see like where you want to be. Like do you want to be a little bit closer to the center, hopefully, because then you won't be attracting such an extreme mate, such an extreme narcissist. And, while they say that most narcissists, most people with these cluster B personality disorders never change, and that's because it's a personality disorder. It is their personality. That's who they are. That's who they've chosen to be. And so they don't really change. And especially when you're looking at someone clear at the one end of the spectrum, the extreme 5 narcissistic person, there's no way that person is going to change, and maybe your partner is just slightly narcissistic. Maybe they're slightly more preoccupied with their own needs and wants and feelings. And yet, if you bring up to them in a healthy way, like, hey, this is something I really need. I give a lot to you when you need emotional support, and right now I really need some emotional support. Can you be there for me? Can you do this for me? And if that person goes, oh, wow, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how much you were struggling with that. What can I do? How can I be there for you? How can I support you? Well, now you've got someone who's willing to change. You've got someone who's willing to be there for you, like genuinely. Then you're probably in a pretty healthy dance with this person, and hopefully there's more of a give and take in the relationship. Whereas if you're at the extreme, it's just that one person is the taker or one person is the giver, and that doesn't change. It just doesn't change. That person doesn't change. And I think, most people who end up in these abusive relationships ask, well, can he change? Can she change? What if we get therapy, or what if we work on this, or what if we go do that, or what if this? Chances are that person's not going to change. Again, if they're slightly narcissistic, there's a good chance that they can change. There's a good chance that they can recognize your needs as well. But if they're at the extreme here, they're not going to change. Like, that's who they are. That's the way that they've learned how to live in life. And that's the way they've learned how to defend themselves and survive. And you can't change that. Like, no amount of love is going to change that. No amount of self-sacrifice on your behalf is going to change that. That person's just going to keep taking. So many times we get into these relationships and we think, well, if I just give a little more, then maybe he or she will want to give back. If I just give a little more, okay, maybe I need to give a little more. And it never works. The person just keeps taking and taking because they think everything's fine. And then the balance gets really, really messed up. And the thing is that you can't change that. Like, if you offer the person the opportunity to admit what they did that hurt you, to admit what they're doing that's not being fair to you, that's not honoring you, if you express a boundary, a reasonable boundary, and this person is absolutely rejecting that, continuing to violate your limits, continuing to shame and guilt you, when you set that boundary, you are dealing with a very toxic person, and you can't change that. There is a chapter in here that talks about the children of a narcissistic parent, where one of the children is usually the golden child. That's the child who learns to please, to fix, to placate the abusive parent. And then the other child becomes the scapegoat, and that's the child that everything gets blamed on. All the negative feelings of the parent gets projected on that child. There's nothing that child can do right. That child, maybe tried to seek love from that parent and was only met with more punishment and more neglect and more abuse and this inability for the parent to show love because the child was not meeting this, image that the parent wanted the child to be. And, Ross talks about how the golden child is usually the one that becomes the codependent and the scapegoat becomes the narcissist. But I don't see that in my life. I don't see that in my practice. I've met a lot of scapegoats who were scapegoats as children who then became codependents because, that's just what they became as an adult. They started looking into themselves. They started realizing like they weren't the problem. They're perfectly lovable. It's just that their parent was unable to give them the love that they deserved. And I don't necessarily seeing it work out as predictable as that. I think oftentimes the golden child can become the narcissist because, if you're always given what you want, if you're doted on, you might develop, this narcissistic sense. You might then believe that you're very entitled. You might then start to treat other people like your narcissistic parent is treating you because you don't see anything wrong with that. And you didn't recognize that as abuse and you just assumed that that was normal. So, I think it can go either way. And I think that really it just comes down to how the child learned to survive, how the child learned to meet with the least amount of resistance, and if that child's survival strategy was to placate, to please, to fix, to follow the whims and, excessive demands of the narcissistic parent, maybe, that child then takes that with them into adulthood and becomes the codependent. Maybe there's some life-changing event that happens, in early adulthood where, something snaps and that person becomes an abusive person, maybe some awful experience happens. And I think it can go either way. I don't think it's predictable that, necessarily the golden child becomes this or the scapegoat becomes that. I have seen this so many times. I've asked a lot of people were you more the golden child? Were you more the scapegoat? And it really seems to be hit or miss. And I think it can go either direction. I think it just depends on the survival strategy that the child learned. I've also noticed that there is a small percentage of these relationships that aren't as black and white. It's not that one person is the abuser and one person is the target, the victim. In about maybe 10% of these relationships, maybe less, but I'm thinking around 10%, it goes back and forth. One day one person's the abuser and one person's the victim, and then they switch roles, and maybe multiple times in a day. And I've only seen this, much more rarely. I get these messages from people telling me that they feel they were partly, involved in the abuse, that they were definitely abusive, and this could be physical abuse as well. And so I would call that a switch dynamic, and I would liken that to the BDSM term for switch. BDSM meaning bondage, discipline, sadomasochism, right? Where typically, in about 90% of the cases, you have one person who's dominant, one person who's submissive. And it pretty much stays in these very clear dynamics. But then you find some people who identify as a switch, and they go back and forth. Sometimes they want to be the dominator, sometimes they want to be the submissive, and they go back and forth. And maybe that's because, growing up, they watched parents with that dynamic, the switch dynamic, go back and forth, and so that's also out there. I really haven't seen that talked about anywhere else, but that's definitely a pattern that I've noticed, that there is this switch dynamic in some relationships, and it is a small percentage of the relationships, but it's definitely out there. And sometimes I hear from people who, as adults, got into these abusive relationships with an emotional manipulator. And I ask them, okay, so, what happened in childhood? How was that similar to what happened in childhood? And sometimes they say, it wasn't. Childhood was great. My parents are great. They're lovely people. Nothing happened. Really? And that's the question I want to ask. So, I wonder, do the people not realize that they were being abused? Do they not recognize the abuse? Because every one of us that got into this kind of abusive relationship as an adult at some point didn't realize that we were being abused. And sometimes it's even harder to look back at childhood and realize that, because you were a child, so you knew even less about the world. You had even less understanding about things. And a lot of times people block it out. A lot of times people block out the abuse. A lot of times people don't remember what happened in childhood. A lot of times, the narcissistic parents rewrote history, and they didn't see things that way at all, and they still don't, and they try to convince you that everything's great. And typically it's more the golden child who is in denial about the abuse. If the golden child wasn't abused at all or very little and didn't recognize the fact that the person was controlling them to be this perfect trophy child, that they had to fulfill these whims, they just assumed that that was how things were. A lot of times that golden child as an adult will look back and rave about how wonderful everything was, in childhood, and not really realize what's going on. Whereas the scapegoat knows very much. The scapegoat is usually the first child to realize what happened, the first child to start to seek healing, to start to seek therapy and other forms of, holistic healing or yoga or various things that they come across. So get this book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, if you want to understand the dynamics of this relationship in terms of a dance, not what the other person is doing. That's more about Psychopath Free. If you haven't read that book yet, Psychopath Free by Jackson Mackenzie, that'll explain to you exactly the patterns, the very predictable patterns of being in a relationship with an emotional manipulator, with someone who has a cluster B personality disorder. This book is wonderful for understanding what part you have in that. Why are you attracted to that? What behaviors and tendencies you have that continues to keep you stuck in that dance, and how you can get out of it. Looking back at childhood, coming to terms with what happened, understanding that that was a template, for love and relationships that you've then come to expect as an adult, and what you can do to get out of that. What are the detrimental and dysfunctional patterns within yourself that you can change to stop attracting these people. And at a certain point along the healing journey, You got to get to that point where you stop just blaming the other person, where you stop just, going on and on about how evil and how awful and this and that. And yeah, all that happened. And yeah, that was true, but at this point, what are you going to do about it? If you don't fix those things inside you, if you don't heal yourself, if you don't get rid of the magnet and the hook that is attracting those people and that kind of abuse into your life, then you're going to keep attracting that. You might get rid of one person in your life, and the next thing you're going to do is meet another person, a different face, the same kinds of patterns, until you get it. Until you see this pattern and you realize like what in you is attracting that, because there is something in you that is attractive to those people. And when you can take ownership of that, when you can take ownership of you and what you brought to the table, when you can take responsibility for who you are, that's the point of empowerment. That's when things start to change, because when you get healthy, that dynamic ends. When you get healthy, there is no longer that polarity, that charge that is attracting those people to you. They will be turned off by you. You'll show up with a very healthy, with a very healthy demeanor, and that person is going to realize they can't pull this over on you. You're not desperately seeking their love. You're not desperately seeking their attention or their approval or their validation, and you're not going to compromise yourself for their whims and their needs and their feelings all the time. And that's not going to be interesting to them. They're going to move on to a much easier target. They're definitely interested in someone who's willing to play that game, who's willing to dance with them. And, recognizing these patterns within yourself is also going to help you recognize these people when they show up in your life. You're going to smell that when it's coming, and you're just going to be like, no thanks. No, I already learned that. I don't want that anymore. I'm healing that part inside myself. I don't need this experience. I don't need to learn that lesson again. So I hope this was helpful for you. Again, I recommend grabbing this book. It's on Amazon. You can see a link for it on Ross Rosenberg's website. The Human Magnet Syndrome. It's a great book to understand the dynamics of these relationships between codependents and emotional manipulators. If you've read the book already and it really helped you with something, go ahead and write that in the comments below. If you want other people to see, how this book helped you and what they can get out of this book, I'm sure people would really appreciate that. If you liked this video, hit like. If you got something out of this that you want to let me know, please go ahead and write that in a comment. If you don't want anyone to see your name, you can send me a private message. If this really moved something for you, let me know. If you notice some of these dynamics in your relationship, if you are working on healing yourself and changing what in you is attracting these people in your life, let me know. And if you know somebody who's going through this, who might benefit from this information, please share this video with them. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon.